Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. For those who don't know, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants is all about bringing science, adventure exploration, and conservation into classrooms across North America and hopefully beyond. I'm very excited today to introduce our guest. We have Alysa McCall. She's a conservation biologist specializing in polar bears. She's based out of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, but spends every fall in Churchill, Manitoba, sometimes referred to as the polar bear capital of the world. So Alysa has been studying polar bears for 7 years now, focusing largely on the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation, and this is one of the first showing impacts of climate change. She currently works for Polar Bears International, supporting research and directing conservation outreach programs. So all with a mission to protect polar bears and a sea ice home for future generations. So we're in luck today because Alysa loves speaking to people around the world about polar bears. So we've got a great group of classrooms from across North America hanging out with us today. Alysa, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, it's great to have you. I know that you'll probably be heading to Churchill soon. I think the season kicks off pretty soon. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I'm heading there in just a couple weeks. I'm going to go watch some polar bears for a month or so.
Pretty darn lucky.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know our classrooms are excited to learn a little bit more about you and what you do, and a little bit about our Canadian population of polar bears.
Definitely. Great. Thanks, Joe. Well, should I just jump right in?
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today and being interested in polar bears. I think they are a super cool animal, and I'm glad that you do too. So right now, I am just at my home. I work from home for parts of the year, and then at other times, I travel around talking about polar bears or going to visit polar bears. So because I'm at home today, you might see a couple of my pets walking around. But today, I just wanted to tell you a few cool things about polar bears. You know, polar bears live all over the world, but there's quite a few populations in Canada. And so I'm going to show you some photos too. And then I'm super excited to hear your questions. Here, I'm just going to screen share. And let me pull this up right away. Cool. And I really hope that this works. Oh, of course, my computer. Hey, Joe, can you see at least the one screen? All right.
Slides are open, and it looks like maybe I see the spinning wheel.
Yeah, looks like PowerPoint's having a time of it. But I'll just jump in anyway, and we'll see if it can sort itself out while I talk. Well, polar bears are a super fun animal to study. So I've been studying them for about 7 years, like Joe said, and I've gotten to go to a few different parts of the world. So I've been up to Tuktoyaktuk to study moms and cubs, and I also do a lot of work outside of Churchill, Manitoba, which, as Joe said, is like the polar bear capital of the world. I'm just going to stop screen sharing for 2 seconds while I figure this out. Great. So some of the cool parts about polar bear research is that it's super, super cold, of course, and we need to dress really warm when we're doing it. When we go up to study polar bears, we have to wear really thick coats and toques and mittens, and I wear my mucklucks too when I go up there. Polar bears live all across the Arctic. They are called a circumpolar animal, though, so they do not live at the North Pole. And this is because there's not a lot of food at the North Pole. And if I can pull this up, then I will show you. So polar bears live in 5 countries, and that is the US, Canada, Russia, Norway, and Greenland. I'm really going to try to show you guys. I got some cool videos. All right, cool. Can you see this now? Is this working?
Yep, we got it.
Cool. All right. Here we go. This will be more fun. Cool. So that's me with some cubs up in Tuktoyaktuk. That's me this last spring on the sea ice studying polar bears off of Churchill. Cool. And here we go. We'll see if this will work for you. Here's where the polar bears live. Oh, I'm so sorry about my computer not liking this apparently today. But that's okay. We'll move on to here. So polar bears really depend on sea ice. They use sea ice to hunt seals, and they are totally adapted for this environment. So polar bears have really small ears, they've got a really small tail, and this helps keep them warm. They've got white fur. Well, it's actually clear and hollow. It helps them blend in and camouflage. They've got huge paws that help distribute their weight so they can spread out their really heavy body across thin ice so they don't break through. They've got a beautifully sloped nose that helps them go in and out of seal holes to hunt. And they have 2 layers of very thick fur. So they've got a very thick downy undercoat that's kind of like us wearing a sweater. And then they've got long, beautiful, coarse hairs over top that's kind of like their raincoat. And this keeps them really warm even when it's super, super cold outside. And this just does not want to work for me right now. You know, you can practice as many times as you want and you only can go so far, can't you? But okay. I'll just talk to it. Yeah, how about I just talk to it and then I can answer you some questions too. Let me try to stop this. Everything. All right, well, how about I talk about some cool stuff we get to do with polar bears? One of the cool things that we've learned from polar bears is that we can track them all through the Arctic. So because they like to live really far away from people, if polar bears had their way, they wouldn't ever even want to come close to people. They want to be way out on the sea ice, hunting seals far, far away. So how can we understand what they need and what they do if we can't see them? Well, we can track them in different ways. We can put a collar on the females. So just like if any of you have a dog at home maybe and he wears a collar when he goes outside or she goes outside, it's very similar. We can do the same thing with polar bears, and we can attach a little GPS unit. Maybe some of your parents have a GPS unit in their vehicle and it tells them where to go. Same thing with polar bears. We can give them a little collar that talks to a satellite, and I can sit at home on my computer and download all the locations, and I can track the bears all winter, and it's super cool. But the reason that we can only track females is because males have a really thick neck and they pull collars right off of them. Males just can't hang on to a collar. And so for years, we had no idea what the males were doing. We only knew what the girls were doing. And this was a problem because if you want to really understand animals, you have to know all types of the population. And so just this last year, technology is finally good enough that we can give the males a little GPS earring. They get a little ear tag, and it doesn't last as long. It only lasts about 3 to 6 months, but we can now track the males all over the sea ice. And so that is pretty cool. Protect communities. So as our sea ice is declining, as the world's warming up and there's less habitat or less home for the polar bears, what we're seeing is that they're spending more time on land. And when they spend more time on land, they come in more contact with people. And in a lot of these communities, they have kids just like your age, and these kids want to go play outside and hang out on the playgrounds and trick or treat at Halloween, but there's polar bears around. And so we work to help keep communities safe. We want to support these communities in keeping their kids and people safe, and also the polar bears safe. And so if we can track bears, we can watch them and we can find out before they get to a town, and we can call that community and say, hey, there's a polar bear coming. And so they know to be on the alert. So that's pretty cool. And we can also train people to watch out for polar bears. They're called bear monitors, and that's a full-time job in parts of the Arctic. Your entire job is to go outside and watch for polar bears and to keep people safe, so that's pretty cool. Lots of times those guys get, you know, they're on snowmobiles or maybe in vehicles, and they're patrolling their town, keeping them safe. Some other types of polar bear work we do whenever we capture a polar bear, when we're out on the sea ice, we find them in a helicopter, and we tranquilize them, so that means put them to sleep for just about an hour. So they just have a little nap, and it just keeps them safe and us safe while we measure them. And so we can measure a polar bear's skull width and skull length. We measure their body size. We can take samples from their hair. And we can find out so much cool stuff from your hair. Did you guys know your own hair tells a lot about you if we analyzed it? So when we analyze polar bear hair, we can look at stress hormones, see if they're stressed out about something. We can look at what they've been eating. Your diet actually shows up in your hair, which is pretty crazy. And for polar bears, we can see what kind of seals they're eating out there. If they're eating ringed seals or bearded seals, we know that just from looking at their hair. And we can also look at their genetics. And so this has been something that's pretty recent, but just like, you know, we can trace our genetics back through our ancestors. We know who our mom and dad is based on genetics. We can do the same thing with polar bears. So polar bears only hang out with their mom and so we never knew what dads were out there and who was fathering the polar bear cubs. But now we do know. We can trace it with genetics, which is pretty neat. And one of the cool things that we found was a growler bear. Has anyone ever heard of a growler bear? Maybe? Can you guess what that is maybe? It's a cross between a grizzly bear and a polar bear. And there was a few of those way up north a couple years ago, and we didn't know what was going on. There was this little group of kind of funny looking brownish whitish bears that weren't really well suited for ice or for land. But it turns out when we did the genetics, we could find out what was happening. And we found out that it was just one polar bear female that had mated with a couple grizzly bear males. And those cubs had more cubs, and so they all just were traced back to one female. So we probably won't see many more growler bears out there, but for a little while we were very confused. But science can help us answer questions when we're confused about something or we've got questions. We can use these different cool technology tools, whether we're tracking polar bears or measuring them or running their genetics. We can help answer questions and find out way more about polar bears, which is really, really important because polar bears right now are threatened by a melting sea ice habitat. They depend on sea ice for all their food. So seals have really fat blubber, and that's polar bears' favorite food. If they could, they would only eat blubber. They don't really even want to eat meat and berries like the other bears do. And the only place that polar bears can find blubber is if they use the sea ice to go hunting for it. So if they're stuck on land, they don't get enough food. And polar bears need more food than all the other bears, and so we really need to make sure there's sea ice for them to keep hunting. And what's happening is that humans figured out how to burn fossil fuels, so that's like coal and oil and gas, and we burn these things for heating our homes and transporting goods. And when we do this, it releases what we call carbon dioxide emissions. And in normal amounts, this is okay. Carbon dioxide traps heat like a heat trapping blanket in our atmosphere, and this has actually allowed us to live on Earth. We already have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it helps us be at a temperature that humans can live at. But when we burn extra fossil fuels, we put too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and our heat trapping blanket just got way too thick. So we have too many blankets on right now. Our parka's too thick, whatever you want to call it. So we need to find other ways to use fuels, and we have some really cool options. We can use solar, we can use wind, and we can transition to more of those, and we can use less fossil fuels, so we can drive our cars less, we can ride our bikes more, we can use less electricity that comes from coal. You guys maybe recycle at school. I'm sure a lot of you like to walk and go play outside. Those are all really, really great things to do. And all that helps polar bears, and it helps people too. It helps keep our air cleaner, and it helps keep us healthier. And it's really, really good for polar bears, even though you might not live anywhere close to polar bears. Part to help them. And that's really neat because so many polar bears live in Canada and the US. In fact, Canada has 2/3 of the world's polar bears. So we've got more polar bears than anywhere else in the world. And it's really important that we protect them because they're such a special animal, and they're so neat. And the Arctic is just a super fun, amazing ecosystem. And a lot of people live in the Arctic, and they need the sea ice too. So because I can't show you my slides because my PowerPoint is not having it, I am happy to take some questions now, and I can try to work on showing you guys. And if I can't show my slides, then maybe I can share them with your teachers because there's some cool animations and stuff. I'll send them to Joe, and you guys can watch little videos later. Does that work? But I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
I think that works for sure.
Cool.
So maybe while we do some questions, if you want to try to open in the background, but I don't think it's, I don't think it'll make or break things.
Okay,
you're right.
cool.
And the classrooms can see some of the animations. But let's meet some of those classrooms because we have a lot of great classrooms joining us. So let's start off in British Columbia. We have a grade 2 classroom from Rose Valley Elementary from Kelowna, British Columbia. Let me turn your microphone on and go ahead. We'll meet each classroom for a question, then we'll swing back for some more.
Perfect.
Okay, 1 second. I'm just going to get my person that's going to ask a question. Okay, good. Yeah, good question. Okay, you have to say it nice and loud. Okay, when you get up here, she's going to see you. Okay, there you are.
Why did you want to help the polar bears?
Oh, that's a really nice question.
Oh, she heard you. Good. Okay.
Yeah. Why do I want to help the polar bears? Why did I want to? You know what? It was kind of an accident, to be honest. I always really loved animals and wanted to help animals ever since I was really little. And when I started university after high school, I was studying mice for many years. I went out into the field and trapped mice and studied mice, and I loved it. And they were so cute and cool. And I studied toads for a while, and I was doing all these little things. And then I just met someone who knew someone who studied polar bears, and I had an opportunity to go try it out, and I really liked it. I just thought it was such a unique type of environment. And I think polar bears are so special because for a lot of animals, like say for a gorilla, if we want to help a gorilla, we can do things like plant more trees, or maybe we can put up a fence to protect where it lives, or maybe we can protect it from people that are trying to hurt it. And so those are things that we can do right now, and they're really clear and we can see them. But for polar bears, when we want to help them, we really need the entire world to get on board and make changes at home. And it's such a special type of conservation. And for polar bears, the entire world needs to help them rather than just a few of us. And I thought that was super cool. Plus, they're just beautiful, and they're funny, and they've got a lot of personality. And I think they're really great to work with. So I've stuck with polar bears for a while, and I have a lot of fun seeing them every fall. Thank you so much for your question.
All right, that was a great question. Thank you. We're going to jump to another grade 2 classroom in Sterling, Virginia at Algonquian Elementary. And as I said, they're second grade. Let me turn their microphone on. There we go.
My name's Tegan, and my question is, how many different types of polar bears are there?
Ooh, how many different types of polar bears are there? Thanks, Tegan. So there is only one actual species of polar bears. So no matter where in the world we are, polar bears can all mate with each other. But that's such a cool question because there's 19 different subpopulations of polar bears, so 19 groups of them. And certain little groups have slightly different genetics. So we know, for example, in James Bay, which is just off of Hudson Bay in Canada, the bears that live in James Bay have different genes than the ones that live in Hudson Bay. So while they can all mix, they've got very special things about them that we want to protect. And there's some bears up in northern Canada that sometimes are called weasel bears. I've never seen them, but apparently they look longer and are a little bit skinnier. And so while they're all one polar bear, depending on where they live and who they're mating with, we get kind of certain different pockets of polar bears. But there's just one general polar bear species. That's a really fun question.
Awesome question. And I hope you get to see a weasel bear someday.
Me too. They sound interesting.
All right, let's meet another classroom. Mrs. Cathcart's class is joining us from Hewitt's Creek Public School in Barrie, Ontario. They're a grade 4-5 classroom. And I'm going to turn your microphone on.
Hey, what? Yeah.
How long can polar bears stay underwater for?
Oh, great question. So the record that we've ever recorded in the wild was in Norway, and it was a really hungry polar bear that was actually diving for seaweed because he had no other food, and he held his breath underwater for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. So that's the record we have for polar bears. So that's pretty good. I can't hold my breath for nearly that long. Super fun question.
That's a pretty incredible length of time for a polar bear, but yeah, it is unfortunate that some have to resort to that to find some food.
Yeah, that's definitely not their favorite thing to do.
All right. Let's see. Let's visit with Mrs. Fisher's class in Hamilton, Ontario, grade 4 classroom from Queen Victoria. Your microphone is on.
So I'm wondering, don't polar bears get annoyed when they put on the tags on the ears?
Yeah, so don't polar bears get annoyed when they put tags on the ears? That's a really thoughtful question. So as a biologist, when we want to find out stuff about animals, we do need to handle the animals and sometimes put tags on them to track them over many years. And we are really concerned about whether this affects the animal. If you put something on an animal that changes its behavior, then you're not really getting at the natural way of the animal. So we've made the tags that we put on bears very, very small. They're white and they blend in with the polar bear. And what we found after doing this for a couple decades is that the tags don't seem to bother the polar bears. In some cases, when we've collared females, they've pulled the collar off right away. And so maybe those females were bothered, but other females haven't been bothered at all. The animals have so much going on in their world, and they're so used to dealing with stress on their body that we don't think it really bothers them at all to have these little things. But we're always trying to do smaller and smaller devices and lighter, and really do the least amount we can to them to find out the most amount of information. And that's such a thoughtful question, because that's something biologists are always thinking about, is that we do not want to bother the animal. We do this work because we love the animals and we want to learn more, and we don't want to bother them. So thanks for that. But yeah, so far we don't think the tags bother them.
Okay, we're going to jump to Anaheim now. Anaheim. We've got a group of grade 4 classrooms joining us from Mann Elementary. Let me turn your microphone on.
Thank you. Go ahead, try to say and introduce yourself. My name is Luis Vasquez. My question is, if polar bears are anything like black bears or brown bears?
Oh yeah, are polar bears anything like black bears or brown bears? So polar bears split off from a brown bear ancestor a couple 100,000 years ago. So they are still somewhat similar in some ways, and we can see that because they can still breed with each other, which means they're kind of similar. But they have some very key differences. So overall, bears across the world, there's 8 species of bears, and all of them are really, really smart. I think they all have pretty good eyesight. They all love to eat. Bears love food. That's pretty common. So all bears have some similarities, but polar bears are split from brown and black bears in a couple ways. So polar bears have certain genetic differences in how they digest food. So black and brown bears can digest protein, so meat, and carbohydrates like berries and sugar, much, much better than polar bears can. Polar bears have, I think it's like 6 very specific changes in their gut that makes it so that they can really digest fat the best. And they don't do that great eating protein and carbs. So for polar bears, about 90% of all the fat they eat goes directly onto their body. It's super efficient. If humans had that, we would all be in a lot of trouble. And the black and brown bears don't have that either. So the diet's a big thing. Also, polar bears have different teeth than black and brown bears. They're much more suited for eating fat and meat, pulling something that's not super tough. And polar bears actually have weaker jaws than brown bears. Brown bears need really strong jaws because they're ripping and tearing meat, and they might be crunching bones and grinding more fibrous food like roots, whereas polar bears don't have to do that. So brown bears actually have much stronger jaws. And of course, the coloring, the coats are different depending on where they live. Polar bears are the biggest bear of all. Some brown bears will be bigger than some polar bears, but at the end of the day, because polar bears have the most calories that they eat, polar bears can get the very, very biggest. And polar bears are the only marine bear. So black and brown bears are really terrestrial animals, and polar bears are considered marine mammals. So they're really ocean linked. And if polar bears had their way, they would never even come onto land. So those are probably the biggest differences. But all the bears across the world are super interesting for their different adaptations to their environment. Thanks for that question.
All right, that was a great question and a great answer. Thank you for summarizing that so well. That was really good. Thank you. Our next group is from Smooth Rock Falls Public School in Smooth Rock Falls. And there's a mixture of students from grades 4 to 6. And your camera seems to be off, but let's see if we can hear you. So let me turn your microphone on. All right, so oh, there we go. Can you guys hear us? You can see they're trying to turn their microphone on and off, but maybe they're having some tech trouble. So Smooth Rock Falls, if you guys can still hear and see us, why don't you type your questions in via the blue chat sidebar, and I'll make sure that I get those questions in. But it looks like there might be some technical difficulties. All right, our final class is joining us from St. Matthews in Sarnia, Ontario, Mrs. Hamill's group. Let me turn your microphone on.
Great horse. I can't be in the camera, but
That's okay.
do polar bears live as families or as packs?
Oh, cool question. So generally, polar bears only live as families, and cubs only live with their mom, and only for about 2.5 years. So females give birth in their dens alone, and then they emerge from their dens with their cubs and raise them for 2.5 years. And in some cases, we think that the moms kind of want to avoid other polar bears as much as they can. Sometimes adult males will kill cubs. And so everyone, we think, tries to kind of keep separate. And we think they mostly keep separate out on the sea ice. But there's certain places at certain times of the year where polar bears do get together in groups. And so one of these places is Churchill, Manitoba. Another place is called Kaktovik, Alaska. And these are different for different reasons. So in Kaktovik, in the summer, the people that live there hunt a whale every summer, and they pull the whale onto shore and take the meat that they need, but then there's a lot left over. And so polar bears will come in from all over and eat together at one whale carcass. And so we can see over a dozen polar bears at one time. So that's kind of interesting because that's unique. And then in Churchill, Manitoba, the reason we see a lot of polar bears at one spot is because they're waiting for sea ice. So right now it's been summer, it's been warm, and there's no ice on Hudson Bay. But pretty soon, as we enter into October and November, it's going to get cold. And eventually Hudson Bay will freeze over in sea ice, and the polar bears will go out and hunt. But until then, they're kind of getting antsy. So they haven't eaten for months. They've been resting, but now they're feeling the temperature drop. And so they're like, well, they want to be the first on the ice. So they're all moving up to the coast. And so they're hanging out together on the coast just outside the town of Churchill, Manitoba. And they're basically just relaxing mostly. Sometimes they play fight, which we call sparring. And they're just grouped together. And they're not really eating or hunting, but they do seem to have a higher tolerance for each other. Because they're all waiting together. But we don't really think they roam the sea ice in packs, but we have a lot left to learn about what goes on the sea ice. So maybe we will know more about your question in the coming years. But as far as we know, they're mostly solitary unless they have cubs. So really good question.
All right, they've all been really great questions. We visited each of our classrooms from a nice stretch, different areas of North America. So thank you for the questions so far. So Alysa, I thought we'd see, do you want to give the pictures one more try, or should we just stick with a round of questions?
Let's see if I can give them one more quick try. And yeah, if not, like I said, I'm happy to share them with people. There's some cool clips and stuff. Here, let me see if I can show this guy.
What I'll try and do is turn off the classroom cameras, and that might give us a little more bandwidth.
Maybe my computer is just struggling a little bit. All right, so I'm going to try to screen share you guys. So I'm going to try to show you a growler bear here. Let me see if it works. All right.
Cameras are off, so hopefully that helps.
All right. Can you see that?
Yep.
Cool. So this is the growler bear I was talking about. So this is a half polar bear, half grizzly bear. So you can see it kind of has a funny face shape. It's not the scooped nose of a grizzly nor the nicely curved nose of a polar bear. It's kind of a weird mix of yellowish brown, and its feet are only about half furred. So for polar bears, we see very furry feet, and for grizzly bears, not very furry feet. And so this kind of has a mixture. So like I said, biologists had a question, like, what is going on here? And so we can answer that question using science. And using the genetics, we found out that one polar bear female had mated with a couple brown bears and had a couple cubs. So that's pretty interesting. Let's see if this works. I don't know if this is going to work, but if it does, it's cool. Maybe it's not going to work. All right, I'll share that with you. So this, I'll just tell you guys about it, maybe. Nope, doesn't want to work, and I've done it again. But so one of the things that we're worried about with polar bears as the sea ice changes is that when sea ice gets thinner, and it breaks up more, it moves around a lot. And it's kind of like a polar bear is walking on a treadmill out on the sea ice now. And so that means that it's expending a lot of energy. So if any one of you has ever been on a treadmill, you know, you're using up a lot of your energy and you need to eat after, and maybe you need to eat more to kind of get back to where you were energy-wise. And so we're worried about how much energy polar bears are going to expend when the sea ice keeps moving. And so what we've been able to do is work with some really fantastic zoo polar bears and get them on a treadmill. So some areas have trained polar bears to walk on a treadmill, and we've been able to analyze how many calories they're spending, basically. And so we can compare that to then how many calories they can eat and how much harder it is to find food out there and how much more they're walking. And we can get a really good idea of the energy that polar bears are going to need if the climate keeps on warming and they keep losing sea ice. So that's a pretty neat thing. And yeah, my computer just, I'm sorry about that, but I'm happy to show people that separately.
That's okay. It was worth a try. I'm glad we got to see a picture of the Growler bear.
Yeah, you got to see something anyway. So that's fun.
Heard them referred to as Pizzly bears.
Oh, so this is also a good question. So when we talk about hybrids, what we tend to do in science is put the father's name first and the mother's name second when we combine them. So this is a Growler bear because the father was a grizzly bear and the mother was a polar bear. And so a Pizzly bear would be a polar bear father and a grizzly mother. And we've never seen that. So if we ever did see that, we could call it a Pizzly. But for right now, we only know of Growler bears. So that's the difference.
All right. Well, let's deal with some more questions from our classroom. So what we'll do now is if there's a question in any of the classrooms, come right up to the camera so I can see you looking and waving, and then I'll pick your classroom and we'll go from there, kind of a lightning round of questions. So when I see someone up at the camera, we'll go to that. I do see waving hands, so there's definitely interest in questions. So let's go to Anaheim, because I think I saw wave there first. All right, your microphone's on.
My name is Savannah, and my question is, where do the polar bears go when the climate change?
Excellent question. Where do the polar bears go when the climate changes? So across the whole Arctic, some polar bears still have sea ice, and some polar bears never in their whole lives come to land. They don't need to. And in other parts of the Arctic, they do spend some time on land, and that's been really normal. But as we see sea ice decline, and if nothing changes, we are going to see a lot of sea ice decline. We know that we can help polar bears, but just for example, say that we couldn't do anything. We don't really know, to be honest. We could see a few different things. We could see polar bears trying to spend more and more time on land, but this would mean that they're hungrier and they get smaller, and they probably come into too much contact with human towns looking for food. So that wouldn't be very good. We'll probably see some polar bears just not be able to move anywhere, and we just might see them perish in certain areas. And we might see some polar bears migrate farther north up to kind of where the remaining bits of sea ice are. And so we might see overcrowded populations. And we're not really sure how that will play out, because a lot of it depends on what's happening with the seals, with the food, of course. So a lot of main predators, you know, their entire population size and health is really dependent on what's going on in the food chain below them with their prey. If you don't have food, you can't survive well and make babies. So the biggest thing is we're not sure. What we think of, if nothing changes at all, we could lose 2/3 of the world's polar bears by the end of the century. And we don't want to see that happen. That's not good for people, and it's not good for polar bears. So we're really hoping to protect the sea ice we have now. And because we can't put a border around sea ice, that's why we ask students like you and people all over the world to help us help polar bears, because we don't know what they're going to do when the sea ice really declines, but we know it's not going to be healthy for them. So thank you for asking that.
Okay, I see someone at the camera in Mrs. Fisher's class. Let me turn the microphone on.
Hello, my name is Aiden. I'm wondering, what is the biggest polar bear?
Oh, the biggest polar bear. Good question. So I think the biggest polar bear anyone ever found was up in Alaska, and I believe, well, it was a couple decades ago, and I believe he was about 2,100 pounds or so. So I don't even know what to compare that to. I think that's like a small car or something like that. That is a big polar bear. But usually male polar bears are closer to about 1,300 to 1,500 pounds. So that's probably like maybe a whole classroom of you. And females are about half the size. So females are only half as big as males. And males are much bigger because they have to fight for mates. So they have to be big and strong because they fight a lot more than the females do.
All right. Before we visit our next classroom on YouTube, room 213 from Paris, Ontario is saying hi. And they have a question that they sent to the chat bar. They're wondering, how far south can a polar bear live? Or maybe how far south has the polar bear been seen?
Oh, that's a good question. So polar bears do live in Ontario. For those of you from Ontario, they live right to the southern point of James Bay. You know what? I would need to actually pull up what latitude that is, but they live pretty far south, and I'm not sure the farthest south they've ever been, but I know it was in, I think it was in Manitoba, a polar bear walked inland, almost like 70 kilometers or something like that. Much too far inland for normal. We think maybe it might have been very confused polar bear. But they do live quite far south. If you look at a map and how far south James Bay goes and the tip of it into Ontario, you guys, a lot of you aren't very far from polar bears at all. Yeah, so they can live in some areas that get pretty warm in the summer too.
All right. Thank you, room 213, for watching along. Let's see, Mrs. Cathcart's classroom. I think I see someone up at the camera. Let me turn that mic on.
What can we do to save the polar bears, and what impact are we doing on them?
Oh, that's such a nice question. So what can we do to help the polar bears, and what impact can we have on them? Well, I'm sure you guys are already doing a lot to help polar bears, and maybe you don't even know it. I think younger generations are growing up really having a better idea of why it's so important to help the environment. And so if any of you ride your bike or walk instead of driving to school, if you guys turn off your lights when you're done with them, you can see my cat is visiting over here. If you guys turn off your games when you're done with your games, if you recycle at home and you talk to your parents about that, then that's all really good. And I think kids have such an important role to play influencing your parents too. You guys can talk to your parents about maybe getting more energy efficient light bulbs at home and things like that. But the biggest things we can do is as a community, because it's not one single person's responsibility to help polar bears. That's way too much pressure, and that shouldn't be how it is. What we can really do is we can talk to our government officials. You can talk to your mayor. You guys could talk to your school district about changing bus routes, or about providing better bus schedules, or better community composting. You can, anything that's working together to make the environment cleaner for you guys and your own families is going to be good for polar bears, which is the super cool thing about polar bears. And so when we talk about big changes, we really need it to come from our leaders. And so maybe as you guys are growing up, there's some really important things to do, because you are going to make thousands upon thousands of cool decisions in your lifetime. You guys are going to get to decide where to live and what kind of car you want, and if you want to vote and who you're going to vote for, and what kind of job you want to do, and where you want to buy your clothes. And all these decisions can make big differences, and they don't all have to be perfect. I mean, my house right now is heated by oil. It's the only option I have, and oil's not good, but I can do other things, like I can not drive my car very often, and I compost and recycle a lot. So anything we're doing, working in communities and schools, maybe you can talk to your teacher about turning the lights off when you guys are done in class, turning the computers off. And then when you're older, maybe you can consider being really informed voters, making sure your parents vote, and making sure your parents care about the environment too. All of that is really, really good for polar bears. And we do have an impact on polar bears no matter where we live. All over the world, we can impact polar bears for better or for worse. But we want to make sure it's for the better, because if it's good for polar bears, it's good for people too.
All right, some excellent points. And I saw your cat in the background, and
yeah, he had to come visit.
But
Oh yeah,
Yeah, the
there you
German
go.
Shepherd
That's
visitor a minute ago.
there you go. Perks syndrome.
All right. Mrs. Hamill's class, and then we'll go to British Columbia for another question. So let's start with Mrs. Hamill. Your microphone's on.
How many layers of fur does a polar bear have?
Cool. So polar bears have 2 layers of fur. They've got a thick downy undercoat and then a longer guard hair coat over top. And their fur is hollow and clear. And it's hollow because that helps trap heat. And then it's transparent, which is pretty cool. So they can kind of look like they're different colors when the light hits them differently. So even though they usually look white, especially on the ice, when we see a polar bear in a sunset, it can look like it's orange or sometimes even pink. So that's pretty cool. But their fur helps them keep very, very warm. And it helps them keep warm in the water too. So between their fur and their thick layer of fat, they can handle temperatures that are way colder than we can handle. They can go down to minus 40 degrees very easily. No problem, and they seem to love the cold. We can always see polar bears in Churchill. When it dips below 0, they perk right up. They're just so happy. They really are cold animals for sure.
All right, and let's head over to our class in British Columbia. Let me turn your microphone on. Grade 2s, there we go.
Just say it nice so she can hear you.
Did the polar bears ever try and bite you?
Oh, so not me. When we're in the field, we're really, really careful because none of us want to be bitten by a polar bear. So we make sure the polar bear's asleep and safe. And we always have someone in our group that is watching out for other polar bears. And we're always very aware of the polar bear we're working on. There have been cases of polar bear attacks in some areas. And so that's why we're really big on polar bear safety. I just helped make a polar bear coloring book to help teach students in Churchill, Manitoba and northern communities how to stay safe when they're playing in polar bear country. And we also talk to adults about staying safe with polar bears too, because from what I've heard, it is not very fun to be bitten by a polar bear. I wouldn't want to do that. I have been bitten by a badger and that hurt enough. So I don't want to be bitten by a polar bear. But good question. We're very, very safe out there.
All right. Let's see. Let's go back to Anaheim. I know there's a big group of 3 or 4 classrooms in Anaheim. So I can see new faces at the camera. So let me turn their mic on.
Hi, my name is Alysa. I'm from Man, and I wanted to know what is it like to be next to polar bears?
Oh, that's a fun question. What is it like to be next to polar bears? I think it's really, how do I describe that? It's really kind of awe-inspiring. It kind of helps you forget about anything you're worried about, or it kind of helps you realize why you're doing what you do and why you work really hard. They're so big. They kind of smell weird, to be honest. They kind of smell like a fishy wet dog or something, so that's kind of funny. But they're incredible animals. They're absolutely amazing. And the fact that they live in the populations they do and in the environment they do, it just makes me love nature so much more. It is absolutely fantastic to see them. They are just beautiful and massive, and I can't believe something that big roams around the Arctic. But it's super fun. I really, really enjoy doing it. I like working with all animals. I think they're all definitely special in their own way. Thank you for your question.
Right. Yes, that was a good one. So, Alysa, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. I know the technology didn't go 100%, but that's the nature of technology.
Yeah.
Awesome. Technology, it's never perfect.
No.
But I think that's a great idea. If you pass me a link where they can check out some of the little clips and the little photos, I think that would be a perfect little way to follow up afterwards. Maybe they can dig a little bit deeper and do some of their own research. So I think it's a good opportunity. I know there might be some more questions, so if it's okay with you after we go off air, do you want to stick around for a couple after hours questions from the classes?
Oh yeah, I would love that.
We're able to stay. Perfect. So yeah, thank you again for a great hangout and sharing a little bit about your research and the world of the polar bear. I look forward, of course, to future connections. And maybe just before we log off, can you tell the classes about the cool vehicle that you're going to be hanging out in the near future?
Yeah, so one of the cool things we get to do in Churchill, and this is part of us staying safe there when we're surrounded by polar bears, is that we go out in something called a tundra buggy. And if anyone's, it's kind of like a school bus Hummer vehicle on like really high wheels. So we're in these really tall vehicles, and we roam out very, very slowly over the tundra, and there's polar bears all around us, and we have a live streaming camera that we run all day, every day. And so if you want to see what the live polar bears are doing, you can tune in. And we also do connections from there. And we have bunk beds on these buggies and a little stove and little mini bathrooms, and we're kind of these self-contained little vehicles out there on the tundra, and polar bears will get up on their hind legs and look at us through the windows, and we just get to be right in it in the middle of the tundra and still talking to people all over the world because we get internet out there with a big antenna. So it's pretty fun.
All right, that sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Lisa, again, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Classrooms who are live with us now, if you do have a couple more questions and have time, please stick around and we'll do a little after hours questions. For the classrooms who joined in live on YouTube, and as well those who are going to watch later, thanks so much. And keep your eyes out. There'll be a new newsletter in October with some more Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants hangouts. We still have about 10 hangouts to go this week, so it's a pretty busy schedule. But yeah, thank you so much, and especially for telling the students a little bit about what they can do to help polar bears, because I think that's pretty important. All right. Thank you, classrooms. As we always do, we'll turn on the microphones and let's just say goodbye and thank you to Alysa, and then we'll sign off for today. Questions. So here we go. Microphones coming on.
Okay.
Nice and loud, everyone.
Thank
All right. Thank you again, and we're signing off for today.